Hey there, you just caught me in the middle of putting my final touches on my cloning machine. Now I know what you're saying. Hey, did you just make this machine so you can clone and have yourself? Yeah. Well, that should do it. Time to test this bad boy out. Okay, looking good so... Ugh. I still would. One of the rune effects you can use in my game is the duplicate effect. This will duplicate whatever object is hit by the duplication spell. And this is a pretty simple system. All I do is find the ID for the object, find the corresponding object of this, and then create a copy of it. Here's the code for it. And that's it. Devlog over. Bye. Obviously, just cloning an object is quite simple. You just duplicate the object, that's easy peasy. But when combined with other systems, this creates some level of complexity. The first thing you have to do is actually find a valid position for the duplicate object to go. This is quite simple. All I do is I will check the direction that the spell has been cast from, which is the direction that the spell is traveling reversed. I'll check if there is a valid spawn position for a duplicated object in this position. All I do is have the position data of the regular object. I will then have a collider overlay in this new position, and I will check if there is any collision that would cause any clipping if I was to spawn an object in this position. If there is any clipping in this position, I will check behind the object, to the left of the object, and to the right of the object, relative to the spell's directional positioning, and then if there is further collision in these positions, I will check above the object and below the object, essentially just checking every position around the object that would touch the object, and seeing there is a valid position to actually place a duplicate object. Most of the time, we're going to find a valid position because in actual levels in the game, there is not actually a lot of positions and a lot of places you can place an object where a duplicate cannot also be placed. Next, we have the informational copying I have to do when duplicating an object. Objects require a lot of data and information attached to them in their movement scripts and in their object form scripts and such other which controls what the object is, what form it is currently in, the motion of the object, things like if it's an NPC, the time scale of the object, the actual scale of the object, so on and so forth. So I have to copy all of these informations. The obvious few of these is actually quite simple to copy. The scale is going to be copied over, and then the scale is read by any scaling systems and therefore is not really a huge issue. The actual object form is also copied over, as well as the elemental form that the object is in, because if the previous object is on fire, we know that the duplicated object also needs to be on fire, and we can just make it be on fire. And this is all pretty simple. And I won't go over every single possible thing that can be duplicated over onto a new object because a lot of it is self-explanatory and a lot of it is done automatically. But the funny, interesting ones are worth talking about. The first thing being, since spells can actually be combined with other spell effects, what would happen if you combined the duplication effect with another object effect? Surprisingly, the easiest way to code such a thing is to actually duplicate the object and then instantly have a duplicate of the spell enact its information on the duplicate object instead of enacting the spell information first and then duplicating the object. Why is this the easiest method? I'm not really sure. It just caused the least amount of issues when I set it up this way, and I'm too scared to change it. But in this instance, all we have to do is enact the spell's collide with object function, which is going to run through all the spell's object information, and it's going to interact with the object in the way that the spell combinations have calculated that it should interact. So if it has a push force, it will calculate that it should push the object, and it will do so. If this also includes a duplication, it will duplicate the object, realize that it has duplicated the object, and that it should enact the spell information on the original object and also the duplicate object. So we're basically just going to be running this function twice, once for the stat object and once for the duplicate object. You may be thinking this could cause an infinite loop where objects are going to be having this collision data run twice on each duplicate object, so logically we're going to duplicate the object and then run the same script on the duplicate, which is going to read that it should duplicate the object, so it should duplicate the object, and then run the same script on that duplicate's duplicate, and so on and so forth. But luckily, there's a pretty simple reason why that doesn't happen. And that's because you can only duplicate one object one time. Look, I realize that is the boring game design thing, but it is also the thing in my game that creates the least amount of breakage in puzzles. If you could infinitely duplicate objects, it would get very, very out of control very, very quickly. And between you and me, the game doesn't have a great design when you have more than 50 objects in a room. There is a reason a lot of the actual game layout areas are designed with not very many objects in them, because the game actually, I think, designs and works a lot better when you have a smaller amount of objects in a room, because if you have a larger amount, it can get a bit chaotic and unfun. And I feel like the player working in the restrictions of having a couple objects to work with and a couple objects to plan their spell logics around is more fun for the player. How do I make it so an object only duplicates once? Pretty simple. I have a reference for all duplicated objects. When an object is duplicated, I will assign a value to the original and to the duplicate. The original is saying that it is the original and has a current active duplicate. The duplicate will say that it's a duplicate and has a current active original. Because objects can be destroyed very, very easily with a spell that destroys things, if this was to happen, the value in these scripts would return that the original, or the duplicate, whichever one has been destroyed, is currently null. So when I am duplicating an object, I can read this value and say if it has been duplicated, it will have this script attached. If it has this script attached and there isn't an active duplicate object or an origin object, I can say that something has happened to this duplicate or origin, and therefore it can be duplicated again, and I will be able to make a valid duplicate. So this is accounting for the original having been duplicated, then destroying the original, and then duplicating the duplicate, which will make the first duplicate the new original, and the second duplicate the duplicate's duplicate. That is only the first duplicate. It's kind of if you cloned yourself, and then your clone killed you, the clone would just be you now. Because the game very complicated and have very big brain effects, there is a lot of things I have to account for when duplicating an object. One of these things is if the object is a portal, how will I handle duplication of this object? Well, if the object is a portal and is duplicated, the duplicate should obviously also be a portal, but only two active portals can exist at the same time. So if there is already two active portals, I will make the new duplicated object become a portal because its original form was also a portal. The way portals work is if a new portal is created, the oldest portal is now destroyed and not made a portal anymore. So I will check what the oldest portal is, either the red portal or the blue portal, and then I will sub this portal from being an active portal and removing it from the system. One interesting thing that cannot be duplicated is the rewinding mechanic. The way the rewinding mechanic works is that it gets the position of the object in world space, and then it moves to these previous positions while rewinding. Because the rewind mechanic is designed so it will be able to clip through objects, it is treated as sort of an intangible space, where if you are rewinding you can just phase through objects because in the past you were at that position if an object has moved into your position. This is all fine and well, but if you were to duplicate an object that is rewinding, and then make the duplicate rewind, the position data on the rewind points is going to be identical, and the objects are going to continuously be clipping into each other, while the duplicate is also rewinding. Because they're the same object, their previous history of positions is also going to be identical. So they're going to be rewinding, clipping the entire time, and then on the finishing of the rewind, they're going to be pushed aside because they have detected they are clipping while they have ended their rewinding logic. This looks bad and is bad, and I don't like it, and I've removed it. The current system now is if an object has been rewinding or is rewinding or it has rewind data, then when duplicating, the rewind data will be reset to 0. The logic for this is, I guess, that the duplicate has just started existing, so it should not have previous rewind data, even if the original does, because the duplicate is new and has just been born, so it has no previous positions where it was, and therefore should not rewind to these positions. So when it is duplicated, all this is refreshed, and there is not an overlap of position data in the two duplicated objects if they were to be both rewinding at the same time. Additionally, if one object is rewinding and is hit with a duplicate spell while it is rewinding, which is a pretty difficult thing to pull off with timing, so I don't expect any of you to actually do this, the duplicate object will be set and will not actually be rewinding when it is duplicated. Did you know I have an entire system for automatons that can also cast spells and have their own magical casting logic? I've never talked about it, but I do. Where if combined with spells, these objects will cast the spells that are in their logic. So if you were to cast, for example, the dummy spell with the fire spell, you will create a dummy that then casts a fire spell. Epic. Very fun. I like this mechanic. What happens if you duplicate it? If you were to duplicate this mechanic, then you would create a new automaton that would then have the same magical data and cast the same spells as the original automaton. These would have the same maintained logic for how the automatons actually cast the spell, so everything would be retained, and you would create 2 of these automatons that would cast in the same way. You could even have a dummy that casts a duplicate spell on itself, and then when it casts a spell on itself, it will trigger some additional logic to itself, using an on-spell trigger function. What are on-trigger functions? Well, I'm glad you asked. On-trigger functions are parameters you can add to spells that will determine when the spell is actually cast. These are sort of like adding a delay to your spell, only the delay parameters will only be met when a certain condition is met. These are on touch, on lonely, on spell, on interact, and on touch, on lonely, on spell, on interact, on touch, on spell, on interact, on lonely, on... What is the other one? And on close. A lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. The spell will be cast when the player interacts with the object, or touches the object, or is close to the object, or is far away from the object, or another spell is interacted with the object. These have their own spell parameters, so you can combine these with other spells, for example fire, on touch, when you touch the object it sets on fire. This is all very fine and well, but what happens if you duplicate an object? All of these spell parameters that are attached to the original object must also be duplicated and attached to the duplicate object in the same way. So these will all have an order of activation as well. If you cast 3 on-touch objects, we're going to be casting the first one, the second one, and the third one on the first, second, and third touch of this object. So all of this is maintained and duplicated to the duplicate object. The only caveat to this system is if one of these spell parameters is the one that duplicated the object, we're obviously not going to be duplicating that spell because it just cast on the object and is the cause of the duplication, so no need to duplicate that. Finally, hey, the player can also duplicate. Originally, my intention for this mechanic was for the player to make a dummy NPC object, which is going to be a weird little blobby thing with their hats, which I thought was very cute. And then I realized that there are so many unique player movement interactions for each of the spell material forms that there would be a bit of tonal dissonance and gameplay unsynergy if the player was to duplicate themselves and then their duplicate acted in a completely different way when transformed into different materials. So when the player duplicates themselves, they make another version of the player. I just duplicate the actual player in the scripting. The only difference to this is that the root player actually has a lot of logic attached to them for how spells should work, so I can't actually just duplicate the player, so I have a modified version of the player that has references to the original player for all of these logic scriptings. The only downside of this is that when destroyed, the duplicate will actually just blow up and the original player will turn into a ghost. So it doesn't have the same logic as other objects in the scene where when one is destroyed, the surviving object will be maintained as the core original version, which is a bit disappointing. Maybe I will work around this in some way, but realistically I think it's fine. I don't think it's a big deal. I may in the future rework this so the player, when destroyed, will be destroyed for real and will take the position of the duplicate position very, very simply by just copying the duplicate's movement data when the original is destroyed and moving it very sharply to the duplicate and then destroying the duplicate. But that's something for another devlog. When duplicating the player, I will find the same collision data for placing the player as I would when duplicating any object, and then I will also copy the player's state information and pass this over to the duplicate so we can copy the actual player's movement values. The duplicate will then also copy the player's movement, so you can move the duplicate and have her interact with things as well as the player in pretty much the same way. She will also cast the same spells as the player. This is interestingly done because the duplicate doesn't have its own spell menu. It will just open the book at the same time as the player, and then while the player is selecting a spell or casting a spell, the duplicate will copy whatever the spell selection that the original has and just use those in her casting spell logic. An interesting thing about when the player is duplicated is that if the duplicate of the player picks up an item, it will register to the original version of the player and trigger an item pickup UI as if the original player had picked up this item. I think this is a very interesting thing. Obviously, if the duplicate picked up an item, I shouldn't have the item pickup appear over the duplicate's head, because what if the duplicate is off screen in some way or in a position where you can't clearly see the UI pop up over their head? So having it trigger the original version of the player's UI pickup, I think works a lot better and makes a lot more sense and is the good decision that I shall not change. Finally, we have the ways in which the duplication visuals work. I have a very cool animation of the objects rotating around in a fun way when they are duplicated. I quite enjoy this animation quite a lot for the duplication effect. I wanted the duplication to come across very mechanical and almost like you are in a virtual world where something is being duplicated. So the objects are spinning into place and they are very, very flat and then unflattening as they are being duplicated. And I think this is a very cool visual effect. I quite like this animation a lot. I think it is very, very satisfying when you do duplicate something and it has this visual effect. There is also an animated sprite of a hand dragging and dropping the duplicate. I was imagining sort of like a computer system where you are copy and pasting something, because that is essentially what you're doing. So in this setup, you have the hand draw a little square and it drags and drops, and as this is doing, the duplicate animation is playing and it is creating the duplicate object. I think both of these combined together create a very, very interesting visual effect for when duplicating something, and I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. Finally, the weird obscure stuff that doesn't actually maintain when duplicating. All particle effects are removed when duplicating because the original will have its own instances of these particle effects that it creates itself with its own logic system. This is... you don't need to know, this is a bit pointless, honestly. The sticky effect, when a sticky object is stuck to something, where it creates a sticky purple blob on the thing it has stuck to, also gets removed when the thing is duplicating. Would anybody notice or need to know this if I did not point it out? Absolutely not, but it's there. Just in case you were curious. The reason for these two things to work the way they do is because objects have their own logics and parameters for creating particle effects, and objects have their own logic and parameters when creating a sticky mesh when they are stuck to something. Duplicating objects and not removing these things interferes with these logics, so just remove them and have the script make their own. And that is it for devlog. I really like the duplication mechanic. Could you tell that the duplication mechanic, despite being quite a simple thing in scripting, is actually one of the hardest mechanics to have added to the game? This might surprise people on first glance because duplicating an object is a very, very simple thing to do in coding, but when the game has a lot of different things it can do with objects and a lot of different parameters and changes and so on, the actual logic for duplicating stuff gets a bit exponentially complicated when more and more things are added, as in with my game. It requires a lot of testing and a lot of checking for things that can interfere with this or need to be passed over to the duplicate object and could cause issues to it. Luckily, it worked out pretty fine. And a lot of things can be logically passed over to the duplicate and maintain that information, and if not, can just read the origin and pass over what the information should be to the duplicate object. So it works in a pretty satisfying and organic way. The duplication mechanic is a pretty satisfying one to work with, and I'm a pretty big fan of how objects interact and work when duplicating objects. I also think it is pretty funny to have a bunch of objects duplicated and have a bunch of objects in the scene do a bunch of different stuff because they're all being duplicated. Additionally, having two versions of the player I think is very, very fun. I'm always a fan of when games do this, when they have an opportunity for you to make two versions of the player or have two versions of the player interacting at the same time and doing a bunch of stuff. I think this is just very, very satisfying to do, and I'm glad that there is an opportunity to do it in my game. The next devlog will be about something different. Goodbye!